Welcome to Litcast, the podcast covering GCSE literature revision and notes for WJEC. These podcasts are designed to be used as an additional revision tool. There's nothing new or groundbreaking here, just revision notes in an on-the-go friendly format. Using these alone won't guarantee you an A star, but they can help you build your confidence to apply this knowledge to your exam questions and your classwork. With that being said, let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another Litcast. So in this episode we're going to be looking at the character of George Milton and his significance in the novella, as well as his links to 1930s America. So the thing that defines George more than anything else and makes him unique is the fact that he takes responsibility for Lenny, which is really uncharacteristic of kind of typical prejudices and typical attitudes in 1930s America, and his loyalty is what sets him apart. Slim, as we've mentioned before, is a character that the reader trusts and naturally kind of sides with. He says that not many people do what George does, and there's a sense of admiration there as well as sort of confusion as to why he even does it and has that relationship with Lenny. So right from the start we can see that this relationship is something that really defines him and sets him apart from the typical itinerant ranch workers. So he is loyal to Lenny and he's his minder and instructor. He helps keep Lenny out of trouble. We know this from chapter 1 where he mentions the girl in weed, and he helps to sort things out and deals with any problems that they have, and also kind of sets up sort of safe places for Lenny and things for him to do. And Lenny relies on George as well for even the most basic things like getting a job, finding food, and that reliance is important. But George hasn't always been good to Lenny. He once told him to jump in a river and then had to save him from drowning. But he did feel sorry about that because he did then tell Slim that he'll never do anything like that again. So he doesn't always treat him well. He shouts at him, he says nasty things to him, and I suppose you could look at that as a sense of frustration that in this harsh world he has to take responsibility for this person and get no real reward other than the relationship that he has with Lenny, and sometimes that can be a frustrating thing. So even killing Lenny shows how loyal George is as well. He knows that it will be kinder to kill Lenny while he's imagining their dream farm than for the alternative to happen to him, which is to let Curly kill him, which will be in a much more painful and less idyllic way from Lenny's point of view. It's easy to assume that George therefore has no purpose in the novella if he doesn't have Lenny, and that's kind of the only interesting thing to say about him. But that's not true. He does have no problems when he's on his own. He's smart, he's clever, he has no real trouble finding work, and he often talks about the concept of him being better off alone. And sometimes it does seem like he'd actually rather do this than own a farm with Lenny and achieve their joint dream. And there are a few quotes, I could live so easy, or if I was alone I could live so easy, I could go and get a job and work and no trouble. So that frustration does come through on several occasions. But George isn't just with Lenny because he feels responsible for him. Lenny does give him companionship and lets that dream seem more possible simply because there's more than one of them sharing it. And by sharing that dream it does then become more attainable in some way. So some words to potentially describe George are loyal, pessimistic, and maybe in his head realistic, but from our point of view quite pessimistic, but also caring. He does have a caring side as well. And just as a side note, it is worth noting, and this is, if you're aiming for those higher grades and George does come up, then it's worth considering this. George's surname is Milton, and Milton is the last name of the author of one of Steinbeck's favourite works, Paradise Lost. So in that particular work, it describes the story of Genesis and the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve falling from grace. And because of their fall, mankind is doomed to be alone and walk the earth as a lonely being. So some critics believe that George represents that doomed man who longs to return to Eden. And he links to those kind of idyllic utopian ideas that we see in the original setting of Mice and Men in the Brush. And his one chance to avoid that fate of eternal loneliness is his relationship with Lenny, which makes them different from the other lonely men. But despite this companionship, at the end of the book, George is fated to be that lonely man. And it's this that George almost realises, not perhaps to the same extent, but the potential of a life without Lenny and the resulting loneliness means that he does have that conflicting anger and frustration, but also understanding and compassion. And that's what makes his character so interesting. On the one hand, he's quite compassionate and caring towards Lenny, and he remembers his innocence and is always kind of thinking of him and thinking about what would be best for him, but at the same time the frustration comes through because he knows that as well as having that companionship, he also has that responsibility. It's interesting to think that in the typical sense of a narrative, George is the hero of Mice and Men, but actually he is just an ordinary man in an ordinary situation. And in a way that makes it easier for the reader to identify with him and to understand why he does things, and ultimately to understand his actions at the end of the novella and sympathise with him. He is, however, an aggressive character at times. Now this comes out sometimes in his frustration towards Lenny, as we've mentioned before, and he's quite aggressive in the way that he deals with it. But he's also aggressive in other situations in the novella. So when Candy tries to get involved in their dream, George is immediately defensive. And his dislike of Curly means that he orders Lenny to fight back against him, even though there could be dire consequences for both of them. And he even starts off defensive when he's talking to Slim. When Slim comments it's unusual George and Lenny travel together, George snaps back at him. And this is quite sort of typical in terms of attitude of that prejudiced, caged kind of personality that you might get of an itinerant worker at the time, because they don't know who they can trust and they don't necessarily want to let people in. George tells Slim in the novella that lonely men get mean and want to fight all the time. So this aggression hints to the reader that George isn't far off being that stereotypical lonely ranch worker, and actually the only thing stopping him from being that is Lenny. Now, we've mentioned before that George is quite clever. He's quite intelligent, and another example of this is the fact that he can read people quite well, or he sort of picks out characteristics from people and gets what they're about quite easily. So he immediately doesn't like Curly's wife. He's talked about seeing him poisoned before, and warns Lenny to stay away from her, which obviously he doesn't. He quickly trusts Slim, however, so he understands that Slim is perhaps a bit different, and he opens up to him and talks about what happened in Weed, which if he had opened up to other people could have, again, potentially dire consequences, because that could get them to lose their job. And as well as that, he looks at Curly. Speaking of people that he doesn't open up to, he realises that Curly is a character to avoid and almost hates him immediately because he's aggressive towards them. And he's especially aggressive towards Lenny, so that again shows that defensiveness and that sense of responsibility that he shows, and that almost fatherly relationship he has with Lenny. He's also good at reading situations, and he says that the ranch he thinks is not a very good place to be, and he realises after he's met both Curly and Curly's wife that things could go wrong for them there, but they do have to stay because they have no other choice. Again, an example of the difficult choices that they would have had to make at the time. So the dream keeps them going. If we talk about the theme of dreams, the dream is the thing that keeps George focused and stops him from perhaps getting too aggressive or leaving Lenny. And George isn't necessarily in control of his own life because he has that responsibility for Lenny. So he has to find work wherever he can, as itinerant workers did at the time, and work for people he doesn't respect. And as well as that, he's responsible for Lenny but can't necessarily control him or control his behaviour. So George often recites the dream to keep Lenny happy, but sometimes he needs it as well, and he can get sucked in and believes it when he's talking to him. Even though he's a lot more practical about the dream than Lenny is, he still gets sucked into that fantasy of the dream becoming a reality, and he gets entranced with it. At the end of the novel, George is free of Lenny and he could live so easy, just like he said he wanted to in chapter 1, but it's clear that that's not the happy ending that he wanted. It's not the outcome that he wanted, because he'll inevitably be a stereotypical lonely ranch worker now. So if George came up as an essay question in the exam, there's a few things you could talk about that would link him to context, and these are just a few examples that you could use. So in some ways he represents that typical 1930s ranch worker with no job stability, low self-esteem and work being very hard. And his comments about other workers give us an insight into the futile, lonely and empty life of that typical ranch worker. And in many ways he does embody all of the stereotypical aspects of 1930s attitudes that you would have looked at in class. Through his friendship with Lenny and the fact that it's unique, we come to realise 1930s American ranches were harsh and hostile places. And again, this is important to remember, that if you're talking about context, you don't have to talk about characters that fulfil that context. You can talk as well about characters that contrast with that context, because it still highlights it. The fact that George and Lenny have this friendship and it's viewed as so unique and so different highlights the fact that not many other people, or no other people in the context of the novel, actually had a friendship like that. So it's still worth talking about. The way he treats Curly's wife highlights ranch workers' sexist attitudes. So being always on the move, ranch workers rarely form lasting relationships with women and would really only come into contact with them in brothels, which would therefore lead to low opinions of all women. And in his dream with Lenny, George highlights the fact that most dreams at this time were unattainable and or futile. He's also occasionally used to show up the racism of the time, again a typical attitude of the 1930s. So each of those, with a few quotes, could work as a significant point in an essay question. And George as a character, quite often I think, is one that people tend to struggle with, because they feel the only thing they can talk about when it comes to him is his relationship to Lenny. But he is a character in his own right. He's a character by himself, and he is one that, you know, he has some significant moments and has some real character development, and we do empathise with him in his own way, I suppose. So that's some notes on George, and hopefully some hints and tips on how to approach him in the essay question. And that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and come back for the next one. You've been listening to Litcast, the podcast covering GCSE literature revision and notes for WJEC. This podcast is available to download from castbox.com, so if you're listening on YouTube, the link will be in the description below, where you can download these to listen offline on your phone and on the go. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your revision.